much. Morning all. So thank you, JJ. Thanks for all attending as well. Building regulations, everyone's favourite subject. If it's not at the moment, it will be by the end of the day, undoubtedly. My wife did say that, you know, she has to deal with me talking about building regulations all day, every day. So at least you have to only put up for a day. So there you go. Going to talk about, it's a very brief, or brief as much as a day is, introduction to the building regs themselves. So to provide a bit of context, CABE, Chartered Association of Building Engineers, who I'm a fellow of, they provide a 2-week course relating to a much smaller scope of what we're trying to look at today. So I'm going to try and pick and choose some of the key elements which you come across in your day-to-day working lives and try to provide a bit of clarity on what the regulatory requirements are, what the guidance is, and what it all means. But part of that, I suppose, is I'd really like this to be as much of an interactive session as possible. So I will detail what the course aims are, and they're in the booklet that JJ kindly produced and sent out. But it'd be good for me to know kind of what your existing knowledge and expertise is. So by show of hands, how many are general practice surveyors in the room, RIC surveyors and similar? So a smattering, I suppose. So would you, I know we talked earlier on, if you don't mind, what's your key aim of trying to get out of today? What's your thoughts?
I'm increasingly encountering the new regime, and I haven't taken the time really to look into it in enough detail, so I do want to know how much I should be putting on that.
Perfect. I think we will definitely explore. In the last session today, we're going to look at the Building Safety Act, the duty holder regime, what that means in reality. Many people say to me, you know, lots and lots of change of regulations and similar. What I'll do in the first session is kind of outline what has always been the case and what continues to be the case. And I think that's really important to try and understand what's going to happen in the future as well. So we'll bear that in mind. Any architects in the rooms as well? Yes, a couple. What's down this end? What's the aim for architects? Do you mainly work on domestic projects, or is it?
Yes, I do.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Peter.
Peter, nice.
Yeah, so I'm sort of just doing sort of planning, building regulations for mainly sort of domestic work.
Yep.
Really sort of just brushing up really. I mean, obviously I'm using building regs every day.
Yes.
But obviously with the new regime, with the having to sign up as a principal designer, that's sort of that involvement of building control.
Perfect.
I haven't looked into that properly.
Okay.
Going along with it, but not having looked into it.
No, that's a really good. And again, the last session is relating to duty holders, regime, Building Safety Act, those terminologies, principal designer, principal contractor, client, domestic client, compliance declaration. So we'll explore that. But I think the first session is very much a basic understanding, which will very much supplement your concerns that you have relating to those other elements. So who else do we have in the room? Any contractors, developers, anything along those lines? Engineers? Yeah. So engineering-wise, what are you looking for today?
We encounter a lot of time domestic works are completed by contractor, no architect performs it.
Yep.
And they ask us to perform principal design role.
Yes.
Which we refuse. However, like to brush up on.
Perfect. It very much linked in. That's a common recurring theme. So I think that last session would be really beneficial, and I will directly answer that question later on today. Anybody that I've missed? I think we've covered most professions in the built environment. Any? Perfect. Right. So I think the feedback we're getting, a big focus on Building Safety Act, a big focus on duty holders, and just understanding those provisions relating to HRPs and similar. Brilliant. So 4 sessions today. First one this morning, we're going to have a look at an overview of the relevant legislation that impacts the built environment. It's really, people get, when these subsequent questions get asked, people very much get into a muddle because they don't understand the first core principles of what the legislation says. So although it's relatively dry, legislation is dry, it's important that we understand exactly what it says and what it doesn't say, which enables us to make reasonable judgments going forward. So that's the first section. The session later on this morning is relating to fire safety. We're going to focus purely on dwelling houses. So volume 1 is dwelling houses and flats, ADB volume 1. Volume 2 is for all other buildings. I don't have the time within an hour or even 2 weeks to talk about the entirety of volume 1, let alone volume 2. So we're going to focus on some of the key components relating to dwelling houses to give you an understanding of how fire safety guidance in approved document B is set out. Recurring on that theme, the first session in the afternoon, we're going to have a look at the guidance associated with existing buildings, existing dwellings, and new dwellings. So from an architectural perspective, some of the changes that came in as a result to changes to building regulations for parts F, L, O and S. So terms that you might have heard in terms of overheating compliance and those sorts of things. And the last bit, which we've already alluded to, is the duty holder regime. What are the requirements that have recently come into the building regulations which require, by law, those provisions for compliance declarations, principal contractors and principal designers? That's the aim for today. Any questions thus far at all? Good. So, first session, overview of the legislation. So the primary piece of legislation that underpins the built environment in England and Wales, completely separate in Scotland, but we won't touch on that at all, is the Building Act 1984. That's the primary statute, the primary piece of legislation itself. Underpinning that is what's known as statutory instruments. That's secondary legislation, that's regulations. And the one that's predominant in the built environment in England and Wales is the building regulations. Then we're going to have a look at one key component of the building regulations relating to a material change of use. So that's when converting from one purpose group to another. And then we're going to have a look at approved documents and British standards and where they sit legally. Because again, a lot of confusion about, do I have to follow the guidance within approved documents? Do I have to follow the requirements of a British standard and similar? Then plenty of time for questions for me, but then to reinforce what I've talked about, I'm going to put a few questions up on the board, which hopefully you can just mull over whilst we're grabbing a coffee between the next session. So, Building Act 1984. Section 1 of the Building Act enables the Secretary of State, in all reality, the power to make building regulations. First section of the Building Act 1984 itself. And it talks a lot about numerous reasons. That's why we see the introduction of Part S relating to energy infrastructure, environmental concerns. That's probably why we'll see the introduction of Part Z in the coming months and years, which is relating to carbon capture. But the primary reason, right at the start of Section 1, is the health, safety and welfare of people in and around buildings. That's what the building regulations are for. That's what enables building regulations to be made. Approved documents. So approved documents, clues in the title, they are approved by the Secretary of State, by MACLG, for the purpose of providing guidance to meet the requirements of the building regulations themselves. It's important to understand that's the entirety of their legal basis. They are statutory guidance. Statutory, people think, means mandatory. It doesn't. Statutory means the state. Statutory guidance produced under Section 6 of the Building Act, which enables the common construction types, the guidance of the common construction types to meet the functional requirements of the building regulations under Section 6. And Section 7 of the Building Act details the legal status of those approved documents, which is, if you follow the entirety of the guidance within the approved documents, then the tendency is towards removing liability due to compliance. Now, if you don't follow the guidance within the approved documents, the tendency is towards creating liability due to non-compliance. Now, in a very famous case in 2017, it is clear, due to various subsequent reports and Grenfell Tower Phase 2 and all the rest of it, that if you follow the entirety of the guidance within the approved documents, does not necessarily mean that you meet the requirements of the building regulations. The two are distinct. It is guidance for common construction types. That is it, under Section 5 and Section 6. Now, this comes back into the building regulations themselves. So, approved documents, we've talked about, provide statutory guidance to how do you meet the requirements of the building regulations. But the building regulations themselves define legally, within this secondary legislation, firstly what a building is and what building work is as well. And legislation is very much black and white. If you hit the threshold of building work, as defined under Regulation 3, then all of the requirements relating to all of the applicable requirements, I must add, that kick in relating to the building regulations. And if you don't, then none of those requirements kick in. It's very much black and white. So, what is a building? A building is a permanent or temporary building, pretty much. The meaning of building work, as defined in Regulation 3, is what we would expect, and I've extracted a couple of key components there, which is the things that we would expect to see. The erection or extension of building, controlled service or CPD. So if I'm going to use this glorious building as an example on a few occasions, but if we were to extend this building, then that clearly would be an extension of a building, and therefore would meet the threshold of building work under Regulation 3. Now, Regulation 3 is significantly more complex than just extension of buildings themselves. And so that's the entirety of Regulation 3 from the building regulations. So it's all the things that we would expect to see. Extension, erection, extension of control service, a material change of use, which we'll come to later, underpinning, and a couple of elements relating to thermal elements, Regulation 22 and Regulation 23. The one I'm going to just highlight here, which is one I think is often missed within the built environment, is a material alteration. So, paragraph 3, and I will read this by rote. In paragraph 2, relevant requirement means any of the following applicable requirements of Schedule 1, namely Part A, structure, paragraph B, 1, means of escape, B3, internal fire spread, B4, external fire spread, and B5, access and facilities for the fire service, Part M, access, and Part T, toilet accommodation, which came in relatively recently. Those are the relevant requirements that define whether an alteration is material. A material alteration, therefore, is, for the purposes of these regulations, if the work or any part of it would at any stage result in a building or controlled service or fitting not complying with those requirements where previously it did. So that's very much legal speak. But what it means in reality is that if you have a component within a building which is contributing to these requirements, Part A, B1, B3, B4, B5, Part M, T, and even if you are replacing like for like, it is a material alteration because at any stage during the works themselves, it would be less compliant when previously it was. To use a physical example, if we were to replace that column there, for example, and we were going to replace it like for like, but we were going to remove that column, acro-prop it, there's some engineers in the room, forgive my ignorance, acro-prop it, and then reinstall another column in place, another post in place to pick up the ceiling member. That would be a material alteration because during the process of the removal of that column and propping it, it is a material alteration under Part A, structure, which does also bring in numerous elements relating to B1, B3, B4, B5. Because if you have an existing door and you are removing it and replacing it with a door of exactly the same fire resistance, that is a material alteration under B3 and B1 because it contributes to the means of escape of that building. And there's numerous other instances where material alterations also kick in. It's also why, with the engineers in the room, why generally repairs don't meet the threshold of the building regulations. Because if, again using that post there, if it was cracked and shanked and all the rest of it in place, and yet the works that were proposed by the structural engineer related to a bolting on existing additional structural members to that post, then it wouldn't be more unsatisfactory because we're adding things to it. It's when we remove something that results in it being more unsatisfactory during the works themselves. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Can I quickly ask?
Yes, of course.
Because the toilets are, Part T is fairly new. So
Yes.
does that mean if, let's say, in domestic situations, someone's renovating their toilet, do they actually need to go through this?
Part T is only applicable to non-domestic circumstances. So buildings other than dwellings. So offices, this for example, Part T would apply. That provision of no more unsatisfactory is really important, which we'll come to next. But yeah, if you had, it would only be applicable to non-domestic instances. Part M though, for example, if you were, and this is often missed, for example, an access, and you were redesigning your garden at the front of it, existing had a level access and you removed it because you wanted to, that would be a material alteration and would therefore be subject to the building regulations and therefore should have a building control application. The B5 one is really interesting as well because in terms of your provisions, if you have a lovely long sweeping drive and you have a driveway and access gate which is, I don't know, 5 meters wide, and then you decide for whatever reason that you decide to narrow it to 2.4 meters wide, which doesn't meet the provisions of Part B, that's actually a material alteration. So you can see there's some significant elements of work that are subject to the building regulations that probably / definitely aren't having a building control application going in place. But that's what the law says. So, Regulation 4, the intonation wasn't on purpose there. Regulation 4 is requirements relating to building work. So when you read the building regulations, it's supposed to be progressive. We start at Regulation 1, 2, 3, and 4. So, Regulation 4. This basically links into Schedule 1 of the building regulations. And Schedule 1 is what, from a layman's perspective, is what the building regulations are, Part A all the way down to Part T. The one that I think is the most misunderstood section of the building regulations in its entirety is what I've highlighted there in yellow, where it says it complies with the applicable requirements of Schedule 1 or where it did not comply with any such requirement is no more unsatisfactory in relation to that requirement than before the work was carried out. This is this no worse than existing arrangement that is repeated again and again and again, but I think is applied incorrectly in the vast majority of cases. It says applicable requirements of Schedule 1 is, where it did not comply with that requirement is no more unsatisfactory in relation to that requirement. So just because it's an existing beam, just because it's an existing element, if you are making the provision relating to Schedule 1 more unsatisfactory by what you are doing, therefore it's not no more unsatisfactory, it is more unsatisfactory, and therefore it should comply to the relevant requirements. To use that example of a post again, if we were altering the roof structure so that additional load was transferred to that post, then even though it's an existing post, it's subject to Part A of the building regulations, and therefore additional works and additional justification may be required, subject to an engineer confirming what needed to be done or not. The transfer of load from that roof. So Schedule 1, as I said, is where Parts A all the way down to Part T are listed. So, the building regulations themselves are relatively short. A couple of sentences for each requirement. Part A, A1, loading. The building shall be constructed so that the combined dead, imposed and wind loads are sustained, transmitted by it to the ground, safely and without causing such deflection or deformation of any part of the building or such movement of the ground as will impair the stability of any part of another building. Pretty simple. Basically, loads transferred, go safely to the ground, distributed, not resulting in deflection or movement or anything on those lines. All of the things within, it's all within the workbook as well, but just to give you a heads up, all of the information I've extracted and put in all of the slides is freely available for everybody. So all you need to do is type into Google Building Regulations, Building Act, go to the legislation website and it all comes up. So that's Schedule 1. Now, as I said, these are the requirements that most would be familiar with. So we've got Part A, structure, B, fire safety, C, site preparation, resistant to contaminants and moisture, ventilation, sanitation, etc., etc., etc. Energy conservation for L, toilet accommodation, which we've already talked about, charging of electrical vehicles and their infrastructure in relation to Part S. So all of those requirements are listed within Schedule 1. Now, it's important to note that not all buildings are subject to the building regulations themselves. Regulation 2 defines what a building is. Regulation 3 defines what building work is. Regulation 4 is the requirements relating to building work, and that links into Schedule 1, which are the requirements themselves. In Schedule 2, there's a number of classes which dictate what exempt buildings are. This is really important because it explains, I suspect, some of the components that you may well come across in your role in the built environment that you would have seen, which you'd have thought were slightly unsure about why the building regulations apply. So Class 7, for example, really common one, conservatories. So if it's less than 30 metres squared and it complies to Part K, then it's exempt for the purposes of building regulations. Class 6, it's small detached outbuildings, sheds and similar, as long as it's not got any sleeping accommodation in, it's less than 30 metres squared or less than 15 metres squared, and more than a metre from the boundary or non-combustible material, then again, it's exempt from the purposes of the building regulations themselves. And the requirements here are very prescriptive. So if you meet Class 6, then your building is exempt. If you don't, it's not, and then all of the requirements kick in. There's no halfway house. Agricultural buildings, again, if it's purely for the purposes of principal keeping of animals, then it's exempt under the purposes of Schedule 2. Yes?
Conservatory.
Yes?
This habit now of putting a solid roof
Yep.
on conservatories.
Yeah.
What is the impact?
It's a really good point. The reason why, so there's the definition of conservatories within Interpretation Regulation 2, is conservatory is something that's wholly glazed. And the conclusion is that by installing an insulated panelled roof structure, you are no longer making that conservatory wholly glazed, and therefore it stops being exempt under Class 7 and becomes controllable for the purposes of building regulations because it's no longer exempt under Schedule 2. So, but the important thing to note is that it's not in a conservatory situation, it's not like the entirety of the building regulations would apply. So, for example, we'll talk about in the afternoon session about comparative SAPs and extensive glazing 25% rule, which architects come across quite often. Those provisions aren't deemed to be applicable because the actual controllable works, the elements which are subject to the building regulations, is just the installation of an insulated panelled roof system. As long as the thermal separation is maintained between the existing dwelling and the conservatory itself, as long as there's no heating system within the conservatory itself, the controllable element is removing that wholly glazed, but it's just relating to the insulated panelled system itself. So it's still exempt, but the roof structure, the panelled system, is controllable and subject to the building regulations. Any other questions for me? Yes?
I have that one.
No.
Which falls under Class 6, just recently.
Yes.
So it's a small building, just around 14 meters squared.
Yep.
Small pool, changing room.
Yep.
With a toilet.
Yes.
And we've got a food inspector asking for compliance for the toilet part.
Yes, so that's...
The toilet part still...
Exactly. So the point being is that the building itself, because it's a detached building having a floor area of less than 15 metres, is exempt because it doesn't contain any sleeping accommodation. However, the foul drainage installation which supports that sanitary facility in it is controllable. Because
he's asking for Part F compliance.
Well, I think I would point him to Class 6.
Yeah.
Because if it's clear, detached building, floor area less than 15 metres squared, contains no sleeping accommodation, it is exempt. The foul water drainage installation is controllable because it's not included within there, but that's clear.
Okay.
And just a point more generally, building control bodies, they are subject to exactly the same laws that you guys are as well. Local authorities, private building control, the BSR, competent person schemes, all of those bodies, even though they're building control bodies, they don't make the law. Parliament makes the law, we all have to abide by it. So each of those individuals, each of those organisations do, just in the same way as architects, contractors, developers do. We're servants of the law, we should apply it. So, Regulation 5, which is material change of use. So we've talked about Regulation 1, Regulation 2, Regulation 3 for the requirements, and moving on to Regulation 5. So the one that we're going to focus on at the moment is 5A. So this is when there's a change of purpose to the building itself. So say we were going to convert this existing commercial building into a dwelling, for example. Be a lovely house, wouldn't it? But there you go. So that would be a material change of use under 5A of the building regulations themselves. It's important to note that when a material change of use takes place, it is possible, particularly for instances of converting a dwelling, that more than one material change of use is applicable for each of for the same project. To use an example, previously an agricultural building will be subject to 5F of a material change of use, but also will be subject to 5A, because previously it was exempt, that's agricultural building under Schedule 2, Class 3, and now no longer is because we're converting it into a dwelling, but also it's subject to 5A because it's being converted into a dwelling where previously it was not. And that distinction between 5A is really important because under Regulation 6 it then dictates what the relevant requirements are. So, this table here, there's a similar one in your workbooks, but if you type into manual to the building regulations, a similar table comes up. The column that we're going to look at to start with is on the left-hand side, and you can see that the relevant requirements of Schedule 1 are listed and then a tick next to them relating to 5A. So if it's a material change of use under 5A, then it is subject to B1 all the way down to B5, C1, C2, etc., etc., etc. You will note that Part A1, 2, and 3 is not applicable for a material change of use under 5A. Now, remember, this is in instances where the building becomes a dwelling where previously it was not. But that is in the supposition that it was not previously an exempt building. So if we were converting this building into a dwelling, previously, at the moment, it's not an exempt building, and therefore the understanding is that the loading requirements, engineers in the room, for a domestic dwelling house would be significantly less than that of any other purpose that we would have for a controllable building. Engineers will tell us it's, 1.5 live load for domestic instances?
Yeah, 1.5, yes.
Yeah, 1.5, and then 2.5 if we're looking at commercial offices. Exactly. So if we had an office that was in place, 2-story office, and the floor had been designed to accommodate that 2.5 live load, then we're converting it back into a dwelling, then the provisions of Part A have already been met, and therefore we don't need to consider it. Where Part A does kick in is under 5F, like I said, previously exempt. So if we had an agricultural building purely for the purposes relating to the keeping of animals under Class 3, and now we're converting it into a dwelling, Part A, 1, 2, and 3 does apply, and therefore we should consider structure when we're considering the building regs application for the works themselves. Another section of note, I won't go throughout the entirety of them, you can read as well as I can. B1, B5 apply in all instances, makes perfect sense because fire safety is very, very important. Another one to note is that Part K is not applicable in any instances for a material change of use. So Part K, if we go back to what the schedule was, protection from falling, collision and impact. So staircases, guarding and similar. Now, that's really important to understand because you would think, well, why on earth would we retract the requirements relating to guarding, bearing in mind it has a significant impact on the safety of people in and around building, for a material change of use under 5A. And the reason for that is that you need to think about the building regulations as progressive. Read Reg 1, Reg 2, Reg 3, Reg 4. So Regulation 4 also applies as well as Regulation 5. So Regulation 5 for a material change of use, the requirements that we've listed just here. Part K isn't listed, however, Part K is, if it's a new element, will be subject to the requirements of Schedule 1 and should follow the guidance within approved document K or an alternative relevant piece of guidance. And if it's an existing element, then the assumption that we're going to be analysing it and why it should comply is that provision of no more unsatisfactory. So I think it's probably worthwhile just using some real life examples to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here. So example A on the left hand side there, that was an existing, it's all actually at the same similar site or nearby to each other. Photo A on the left hand side there, that was an agricultural building that we converted, or the project converted into a dwelling. They created a new gallery which had guarding installed. It was a new gallery, therefore Schedule 1 applied and Part K applied, and therefore the guarding requirements for that new gallery need to meet the provisions of ADK, which is 1100 millimeters height. So just because it's a material change of use, Regulation 4 does also apply. Using Part K as an example, again, this was an existing office, the photo B, sorry, there's existing steps and stairs on the case there. You can see, sorry, that difference in height is more than 600 millimeters and therefore doesn't meet the requirements of ADK. However, this was an existing office that was being converted into a dwelling. And so we could make the judgment that we have not made the situation more unsatisfactory. Now, the reason why I've utilised that example is the office previously had members of the public going into that space, that had a number of people working in that area, and it was being converted to a private dwelling of 3 or 4 or 5 people, however many people, that would be familiar with that space and be aware of the staircase and the limitations itself. And there was an additional access around the front. So even though the staircase doesn't meet the requirements of Part K, that provision of Regulation 4, no more satisfactory, applies, and therefore it's satisfactory. Now, if we were doing a material change of use in the opposite direction, it was a dwelling being converted into an office, I think it's very difficult to make the judgment regarding no more unsatisfactory. Because, even though it doesn't come under Regulation 5, because the people exposed to that staircase, the number of members of the public, the people that are going to be working in that area, would significantly increase. And therefore the requirement under K, in terms of mitigating risk of fall, would be more unsatisfactory. And therefore, if it was going in the other direction, from dwelling to office, then that wouldn't comply and it wouldn't need to be upgraded. So I think it's important to note, it's not just that it's an existing element, it's whether we've made the Schedule 1 requirements more unsatisfactory. Photo C, this is kind of just an example where we're looking at material alteration again. So it was an existing office converted into a dwelling. Part A doesn't apply. However, the structural engineer detailed the need for strengthening works because of his concerns regarding the roof itself. The strengthening works, again, not meeting the requirements of the material alteration, although they were part of the works themselves, they weren't actually subject to the building regulations because they were strengthening works and not works as a material alteration. And photo D, really simple one, previous barn basically falling down, as previous agricultural barn, as you can expect, the foundations needed to be upgraded because Part A imposed a requirement. Any questions on that at all? I tried to use those examples of Part K and Part A because they're really good ones to try and explain the differences between regulations 4 and 5. So, any questions thus far at all?
Paragraph B.
Yes.
I mean, if I'm advising them that's okay, you can leave that staircase there, I'd be a bit worried that I'll phone me up the next day and say someone's fallen off it.
Well, I think that's a reasonable thing. So Regulation 8 says the provision of the building regulation, which we'll come to later, stipulates that any regulation should be made for the safety and health and well-being for people in and around that building, which is basically Section 1 of the Building Act itself. So if you assess it and you go, I think something needs to happen to make that safe for those people around the buildings, then fine, as a general practice surveyor, then advising it. The point I'm making is the building regulations are minimum standards, and I would not think that, because it's not my viewpoint, it's what the legislation says. So I could advise, I probably would do exactly the same things you. I'd advise you do X, Y, and Z to make it a bit more safer. You know, you've got a 2-year-old moving in, etc. But under the legislation, I can't ask them to replace it or upgrade it or whatever. Approved documents. Sorry, any other questions? Yes?
One more.
Yeah, of course.
What if a building or it's a structure is built as one thing
Yep.
and then converted to another
Yep.
later, but it's built to the stand? I mean, let's say a conservatory,
Yes.
so it's not applicable, it's exempt under the
Yep.
building regs.
Yes.
They put a floor in,
Yes.
it meets, let's say it meets 0.7 U value.
Yep.
It then gets converted into an extension.
Yes.
All the work's done.
Yes.
Technically, the regs say that if that floor meets the minimum threshold,
Yep.
0.7, it complies and doesn't need further. But technically, I mean, if the person built that conservatory with the full intention of, can building control ask for that floor to be retrospectively brought right up to modern standard as if it was an extension?
So there's a few things to unpick there, and we'll come to part L in the first session this afternoon regarding those threshold values that you've talked about in terms of table 4.3 in ADL. I think that the key component is legislation is really black and white. So if you have an conservatory and it's exempt from the purposes of building regulations. Now, if they can upgrade the floor insulation if they want, you know, as part of whatever they're doing. Now, if they were then removing the door separation between the two to make that like an extension and do some other stuff and build walls or whatever, then it should be controllable and therefore should meet the requirements of table 4.2, which is if you were doing any extension on any building. You would not make the assessment that it was an existing thermal element because previously it was an exempt building. That being said, we'll talk about guidance and the statutory requirements. And we talked about what Schedule 1 says. Schedule 1 for Part L, which we'll come to, basically says the energy conservation of the building is sufficient, etc., etc. Now, you would not be meeting the guidance within approved document L by retaining an existing floor in place for a previously exempt building. You wouldn't be if it was, you know, as you said, 0.7, because it should meet table 4.2, 0.18. That being said, you could vary from the guidance within the approved documents as a designer and justify why you believe it to be reasonable.
I mean, say it was an old shed
Yeah.
and it was being upgraded to become part of the habitable space.
Yes.
And the floor met 0.7.
Yes.
Building control don't ask for anything else on the floor. But if it had been built as a new conservatory and then 5 years later was converted
So
to
I-
habitable space,
So
technically it's a
yeah. So from
situation.
correct. Yeah.
Could be
So from our perspective,
played the system.
using that example as a shed or any exempt building, if it no longer becomes exempt, as owner of OWL, we would apply the functional requirements, which would be table 4.2. We would be asking for those requirements relating to 0.18 for the U value of the floor, 0.18 for the U value of external walls, not using table 4.3, which is for existing thermal elements. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
You said about conservatories being wholly glazed.
Yes.
Obviously, most conservatories, or an awful lot, have all floors.
Yes.
Is there a cut-off? Or do they say wholly glazed?
There used to be, then it was removed, and people used to reference the planning legislation, which is completely misnomer. We shouldn't have been referencing that, but people did. So there was reference where it was talking about 50% in essence of the glazing itself. But that's not, there is just wholly glazed, and the interpretation of that, it can be a little bit flexible, which I suspect, I say legislation is black and white and then I make a reference relating to being a bit flexible, but hey ho, that's what it is. But yeah, no, there is no definition within the regs themselves. Approved documents. So, sorry, any questions moving on from that at all? No. Approved documents. So, as I alluded to earlier on, they're guidance sanctioned by the Secretary of State under Section 6 of the Building Act. And they're for use in common construction techniques and methods and projects, and on guidance, statutory guidance, and how you meet the requirements themselves. It's important to note that just because you followed the approved document does not necessarily mean that you comply to the building regulations, and just because you've diverted from them does not mean that you don't comply to the building regulations themselves. Now, approved documents are sanctioned by the Secretary of State, by MHCRG, by the government itself. British standards, and this kind of came to the fore relating to BS 991, which we'll talk about in the next session related to fire safety, British standards are voluntary standards. They don't have the same legal status that an approved document does. However, British standards are produced by industry experts by a recognised industry body, the British Standard Institute. So, and there's a various numbers of standards. 991 is relating to fire safety for domestic dwellings. 9999 is for other buildings. So the whole raft of British standards which you can adhere to, which as long as you're competent to be able to prove that it meets the functional requirements of the building regulations, then you can follow that standard. But they are voluntary standards providing further guidance and not mandatory itself. And that was kind of summarised. This is a letter from Philip White, the director of the HSE, Building Safety Division, so the BSR, stipulating, in essence, people were designing buildings, HRBs, we were talking about before, for 4 or 5 years. There are no transitional arrangements for a British standard. At the end of October last year, 2024, British Standard 2015 ceased to be enforced and 2024 came in. And lots of people are scrambling around going, we've designed in relation to 2015, and we're very concerned. I think it's just illustrates the misunderstanding of where approved documents sit and where British standards sit, which is, as I've alluded to, statutory guidance, voluntary guidance. And that kind of comes to the point relating to duty holders, which we'll talk about later on. So this is a really good document produced by the Building Safety Regulator about what building control should expect duty holders to do. And this is applicable to all building works, not just HRBs. And this is the strategic context that that was produced by the Building Control. And I will just read that by rote. So Building Control should expect duty holders to proactively demonstrate how their project will comply with the building regulations. This should include an explanation of how their project meets the functional requirements of the building regulations from design into occupation. This should include identified risks in their management, evidence on which guidance informed design and construction, so whether you used an approved document or a British standard, and evidence of how duty holders have assessed the appropriateness of the guidance used to demonstrate specific elements of compliance. Legal speak again, but what it means is it's down to the duty holders to determine the type of guidance which is most suitable for the building project that they are designing or undertaking as contractors and similar, and explain why to the building control body, whether that's the HSE, the BSR, local authorities or private building control, why that guidance is applicable and relevant. And what I've done on the next slide is just give an indication of where that all sits. So the law of the land, the primary statute, is the Building Act 1984. Sitting underneath that are the statutory instruments, the secondary regulations, which is the building regulations, some other regulations as well in place, but the building regulations primarily that we'll talk about today. The Building Safety Act we'll come on to later on this afternoon. Statutory guidance is the approved documents sanctioned by the government under Section 6 of the Building Act. And then there's national and international standards, BSEN, British Standards, BS 991, which I've used there, which are industry recognised. And then underneath that are industry standards. So these aren't sanctioned by a national body, but they are recognised as alternative methods. So NHBC standards, manufacturer's requirements and similar can sit within that industry guidance and standards. So, it's worthwhile to note, which we'll come to in the next section relating to fire safety, that in 2017, when 72 people lost their lives, unavoidable lives with a catastrophic systematic failure of everything that we've just talked about, that since 2017, pretty much the vast majority of those requirements have remained in place. However, they have been tweaked and amended, and the shift in terms of clarification of responsibility has shifted towards those who design and build, not towards building control bodies, and we'll come to that in the last section as well. Now, is there any additional questions for me at all after what I've just spoken about? No. Okay, brilliant. So what I would suggest, just so that we get confirmation that it's all kind of sunk in what I've talked about over the last half hour, 45 minutes or so, have a talk amongst yourselves and try and answer those 11 questions or so. feel free just to talk amongst yourselves, jot a note down on the existing workbook, and then we'll follow those up shortly, if that's okay. How do we all get on with those? Hopefully, relatively simple questions. Anyone brave enough to put the answers forward on a couple of these questions? Yeah, so question 7 doesn't need it, completely right, exempt under Schedule 2. Primary and secondary legislation, anyone? Building Act 84, building regs, perfect. There's a load of other secondary legislation which we could talk about. British Building Control Approval Regulations, the Regulatory Reform and Fire Safety Order, etc., etc., etc. But building regulations, Building Act, most keeping that. Section in the Building Act which enables the creation of the building regulations. Section 1, brilliant. What section, bonus, Bruce bonus, what section enables the approval of documents, if anyone remembers? 6. There you go. The legal status of following guidance within approved document. Any approved document. So Part A, Part B, Part C, Part D, E, F, G, H. Statutory guidance, yes, really good. The legal status of it is the tendency towards non-liability. That's basically very much at that point. I'll go back to where we said. Proof of compliance with such a document may be relied as tending towards negative liability. That's the legal status. It's not conclusive, but it's tending towards.
With Minnie Mouse, doesn't it, tending towards?
Yeah. I think as a more general point, I think we're kind of in the position now. I'll come to it later in the last session, one of the requirements of the Grenfell Tower Phase 2 inquiry was to make it even clearer within each and every approved document that following this guidance does not mean that you meet the requirements of the building regulations. So we are in new territory. I think it goes back to that competence and that duty, that strategic context that we talked about. Let me get to. Is it a legal requirement to follow a British standard? No, exactly. So voluntary standards as an alternative to approved documents, which approved documents being for common construction types, if you're going outside of what's defined as a common construction types, very large timber buildings, difficult ground conditions and similar, all of that listed within an approved document. Then it may be more suitable as a competent professional for you to determine that a British standard is the most suitable form of guidance rather than an approved document. But vast majority of building works that happen up and down England and Wales, the most suitable form of guidance will be an approved document itself. A barn conversion previously agricultural takes place to form a new dwelling. Are structural requirements applicable?
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, because it's a material change of use both under 5A, a dwelling where previously it was not, and 5F, an exempt building previously and no longer is. A barn conversion previously an office takes place to form a new dwelling. Are structural requirements applicable? No, exactly what we'll talk about from the engineers over in the corner. The load imposed from an office is significantly higher than that of a domestic dwelling. Doesn't apply under Regulation 5. Regulation 4 would still apply, but bear in mind that loads imposed are going to be significantly less. Generally, we should be okay in terms of not upgrades or similar. Already talked about conservatories. And we know about Schedule 2, where it lists the different classes of buildings that are exempt from purposes of building regulations. And you can see how Regulation 5, relating to material change of use, and Schedule 2 interlink, because it's no longer an exempt building, then it's a material change of use.
There's also something about question 6 then.
Yes.
You're converting an office to a new dwelling.
Yes.
Presumably, you're going to put structural requirement in the fire.
Correct.
There's quite a lot of that going on at the moment, isn't there, with
Yeah.
development.
Yeah, so if it's an existing office and it's being converted into a dwelling, then Part A would not apply under Regulation 5. That being said, Regulation 4 will still apply. So, you know, if as part of the works, it's an important point, as part of the works we had an existing office with internal load-bearing partitions. And if we knock down some of those partitions, it wouldn't just be okay to go fine, it's exempt under Regulation 5, because we've made the situation worse. Therefore, Regulation 4 applies, and therefore we need to adhere to Part A, Schedule 1. Perfect. So we talked about conservatories. What part of Schedule 1 relates to sanitation, hot water, and water efficiency? Part G. So appreciate you won't be as familiar with Schedule 1 as I am, but lists all the way from Part A, structure, B, fire safety, C, site preparation, resistant contaminants and moisture, D, toxic substances. This has kind of been superseded, if I'm completely honest, because it's purely relating to cabinet wall insulation back in the 80s when they were doing very strange things. Part A, resistance to passage of sound. Part F, ventilation. G, sanitation, hot water, safety and water efficiency. H, drainage. J, combustion appliances. K, falling collision and impact. L, conservation of fuel and power. M, access to and use of buildings. O, overheating. P, electrical safety. Q, unauthorised access. R, keep better infrastructure. S, infrastructure for electrical vehicles. And T, toilet provision. Now,
If Joe Bloss goes and puts a new understairs
yep,
and then connects them to the drain outside,
yep,
that's one of them.
correct. Yeah. Applicable requirements of Regulation 4 linking into Schedule 1. Also exactly the same, one is often missed. Existing dwelling, have ground plans, you know, open plan arrangements, all this sort of thing. And they want to remove the downstairs WC for a bit more space. That doesn't comply to Part M because you're removing what was previously the ground floor access sanitary facility. And if you're removing it, you're making the situation worse. Cannot comply, basically. Yes, well, and to give an indication, sorry, many of these...
Sorry, can I go back on that?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
If that toilet
The architects,
did,
yes.
if that toilet did comply,
Yes.
that's not a non-compliant toilet.
Well, it's not a compliant toilet, but you have made the situation worse in terms of the access to and use of buildings themselves for the purposes of sanitary provisions. So just because an existing arrangement doesn't meet the requirements of an approved document, you are removing a sanitary facility on the ground floor, which previously would have been able to be used for those with restricted access, and there is now no longer any sanitary provision in place. Just because it didn't meet the approved document does not mean that you have not made the situation worse. So yes, it would be non-compliant, it wouldn't comply. That being said, there are numerous other methods that you could achieve compliance, perhaps getting in contact with an NRAC assessment to determine whether... Yes, over there, sorry.
That list isn't in this book, is it?
No, so I will provide all of the slides as well, so JJ will email all of these out, which include the questions for your own reading as well. That being said, if you type in to Building Regulations 2010...
No, I know I'd had to do that, it's just... Well, I'm
yeah, of course.
It's not in
yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, so, yeah. If you go onto legislation, all of the requirements of Schedule 1 are listed. Number of those parts in terms of approved documents have Volume 1 relating to dwellings and Volume 2 buildings other than dwellings. So Part B, Part L, for example, the most relevant ones. In terms of the questions, when we get to an existing structural beam is in place which doesn't mean Part A, works in taking place which impose additional loads to the beam. Does it need to be replaced? If so, why? So, structural engineers.
Yes.
So I think that whether it needs to be replaced would be a determination by a structural engineer, a competent professional. But from a legislation requirement, it imposes a requirement under Regulation 4 because it is more unsatisfactory, and therefore an assessment to determine whether it meets requirements of Part A would need to take place. If you were taking that beam out and replacing it even with a like-for-like one, again, it would be a material alteration, and therefore building regs would apply, and therefore building control application would need to take place. An existing fire door is being replaced with a like-for-like alternative. Do the building regulations apply? If so, why? Correct, yes. So if that fire door is forming the means of escape and has an impact in terms of B1, Schedule 1, and even though you're replacing it like for like, at the period that you're removing that door, at that point, it is more unsatisfactory, and therefore the replacement of that door is a material alteration and would require building regs and would require a building control application, or potentially under a competent person scheme, because there are those out there who are able to install doors under a competent person scheme. Yeah.
I'm saying over a lot.
No, perfect, thank you.
People going in and they don't have fire risk assessment.
Yep.
And they look at the fire doors and say, well, these would have complied 20 years ago.
Yes.
We now want them all replaced. We can do that?
Well, that's under I think you're talking about fire risk assessment.
Yeah.
So that's under a separate piece of legislation, Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order. Now, under the RRO, the FSO, whatever you want to call it, there's a need for a risk assessment, a fire risk assessment, to take place normally annually, and for a competent person to undertake that, and a responsible person to appoint a competent person if they're not competent to do so themselves. Now, it's down to the assessment of that competent person to determine the provisions of fire safety for those persons in and around the building to ensure they can evacuate safely. Now, the provisions under the RRO are separate to that of the building regulations. Now, the reason why that's important is because the threshold, the RRO is much more about risk assessment, hazard, determining the risk, mitigating the risk. The building regulations aren't like that. It's not a provision regarding risk assessment, it's compliance. So, if an existing building requires an assessment under the RRO, which they may well stipulate they need to replace the fire doors. That's for the determination of the person who's completed the fire risk assessment. And if they're replacing those doors, they would need a building control application in place. That's pretty simple. Now, under the building regulations themselves, an existing building that's not having any building works as defined under Regulation 3 would not impose a requirement to replace fire doors. If it's an existing building, no alterations, etc., etc. However, if you are having building works done, when we talk about the second session this morning, we talk about fire safety, then there's an assessment of the whole building in its entirety. So if we're having a loft conversion done, for example, that's when we kick in the need for FD20 doors and a protected corridor. So it's two distinct things. Think building regulations, black and white prescriptive, this is what you need to do, albeit with those vagaries of the approved documents and they're not being fully legally watertight. The RS, the Regulatory Reform Order, the Fire Safety Order, is much more about hazard and risk assessment, and that's a different set of assessments, I suppose, than the building regulations themselves.
So if you have an existing dwelling
Yes.
that no longer complies with current regulations,
Yes.
and you add an extension on,
Yep.
that means you've got to upgrade the whole building.
Well, it would depend. So, for example, if you, using a very simple example, we had a domestic dwelling, we put a single-storey extension out back. Go back to that Regulation 4 requirements. So, really good example. We do an extension, but on the front of the building there's an existing beam. We're not having any imposed load on that beam, and therefore it's not building work as defined under Regulation 3, so the front of the building can remain unchanged relating to Part A. So, in essence, we have a building extension which would need to comply, and the rest of the building can remain unaltered, and that's the importance of Regulation 3 and Regulation 4. That being said, there are some provisos with that relating to fire safety, which we'll come to in the next session. And this is kind of a replacement on the theme, I suppose. An existing light fitting is being replaced with a like-for-like alternative. Do the regulations apply? If so, why?
Only if there's an emergency.
Well, so that's a really good answer. Thinking purely from the domestic dwelling house situation, which I'm trying to focus on. Emergency light, definitely, yes, because you're impacting on B1, material alteration, again. But if it's an existing light fitting, and that light fitting is contributing to the fire resistance of the structural elements, then potentially yes, because downlighters in some instances are fire rated, to mitigate fire transfer and maintain fire integrity of any load-bearing elements. And if you're replacing that, even if you're replacing it with a like-for-like alternative, that is a material alteration, and therefore the building regulations apply, and therefore you should have a building control application. Albeit some competent person schemes do enable that to take place. Does that make sense? Hopefully a few bits of food for thought. Any questions for me at all? Brilliant. I think we're going to finish up now, JJ, and grab a cup of tea and a coffee.